I wanted to give a bit of background on the Center for Open Science context of where researchers are coming from, how we kind of are approaching trying to shift these norms, and kind of again, not really talking about large research projects that we're doing, but more about the way that we should be evaluating those projects and thinking about how to both understand as well as shift the current culture around research. So to start, I wanted to kind of give a quick, hold on one moment, a quick background on some of the challenges that we faced in doing this. And so a way to think about this is thinking back to what Robert Merton described in 1942 as the normative values of science. And so that's what's on the left side of the screen, where he described the norms of science as being very open with sharing with colleagues, evaluating the research on the merit of what was done, being motivated by knowledge and discovery, and considering against counter to your own work, right? So being very open to new evidence, theories, and data. And opposite those norms are the counter norms, right? Where science is essentially a secret enterprise. We evaluate research by what journal or what institute or what individual is publishing, right, or discovering, versus evaluating it purely on the merit of the research itself. And we basically treat it like a competition. And the reason for that is because it's all about advancing one's theories to promote one's careers rather than trying to get at all of the evidence and evaluate it on a normalized field. And even though Robert Merton didn't describe it, one could think of it as quality in the norms of the normative values and quantity in the counter norm values. So lucky for us, in 2007, Anderson and colleagues decided to re-investigate Robert Merton's normative values. And what they did is they asked over 3,000 early and mid-career scientists who had NIH funding whether they subscribed to or believed in the normative values of science or the counter norms of science as Robert Merton had described them, or if they thought they were equal. And that's what this graph is showing. So you can see that in the light gray, the vast majority, over 80% of both mid and early career researchers believed in those normative values over the counter norms. A small portion, which is black, believed that the counter norms were more important to what they believed and subscribed to than the normative values. And the hash there says that no, actually both the norms and the counter norms are both equally important to what they believe in. So then Anderson and colleagues said, well, don't tell us what you believe in, tell us what you do. Tell us how you actually behave regarding these values. And what they found is that when people were reflecting back on their own behavior, they still, for the most part, thought that they were practicing according to those normative values, but a larger portion acknowledged that those counter norms creep into their daily practice of research. And again, this is not terribly surprising. It's essentially reaffirming what Robert Merton described in 1942. So then they said, well, don't tell us what you do. Why don't you tell us what everyone around you do? Tell us what your colleagues, how they behave according to these values. And you saw that flip. You saw that the vast majority of early and mid-career NIH researchers who were surveyed for this thought that their colleagues were practicing according to those counter norm values over the normative values. And so this is essentially one of the main challenges that we have in trying to understand the recurrent research culture as well as shift it, which is this inherent bias that we don't even see in ourselves, but that we recognize is around us and the culture that we're practicing in. And one of the central issues of why that's occurring is because all of the incentives are really for the individual are pushed towards getting it published opposed to really focusing on getting it right. And that's because peer review of manuscripts largely contain new findings that improve our understanding of prior work. And careers are essentially made and papers are published based on finding new exciting results at the frontiers of knowledge, not necessarily by verifying prior discoveries or having meticulous research protocols and methods. It's kind of all focused on those shiny positive results, and our entire system's built on that. And there's a lot of ways that, and I imagine you've read this paper and have heard others talk about this as well. There's many ways to kind of hijack and kind of cut short the research cycle. So if we think of research in kind of this circular manner, it's a bit simplified of we start with generating hypotheses to designing our study, collecting the data, analyzing it, interpret, and either keep collecting new experiments or eventually publish if we're lucky enough. There's lots of points along this pathway where the integrity of the research essentially can get compromised. And that's anywhere from failing to control for bias to p-hacking to having low power in your study design, publication bias, and including harking, right? Hypothesizing after those results are known. I'm going to give you some examples of some research that's been published recently that kind of highlights some of these aspects. So one is one in business management that was published in 2015. And here they were deciding to look at how essentially results metamorphosize into articles. And what they were looking at was dissertations that were published, that were subsequently published in journal articles. So they looked at 142 business management dissertations that eventually turned into published articles. And of that, there were of the hypotheses that were stated, which is close to 2,000 in the dissertations, 45% of those were statistically significant in the sense that they were supporting, that's how they essentially had the hypotheses being contained, supported with statistical significance, which is actually a bit troubling in the sense that it's that low. But what's more troubling is that of the hypotheses that were eventually published in the journal article, that increased to 66%. So that was 21% inflation of statistical significance. And essentially, it has a more than doubling ratio of supported to unsupported hypotheses in the dissertations compared to the journal articles. And so what's also troubling is that not all of the hypotheses that were contained in the dissertation eventually made their way into the published article, that many of them, over the vast majority of them actually, because of the 1,978 hypotheses in the dissertations, only 978 were eventually published. So that means 1,000 were silently dropped or removed. And if we look at what was added and removed between the publication and the dissertation, there were 333 hypotheses added to the publication that did not exist in the dissertation. So, and of those, 70% of those were statistically significant. And then if we look at the hypotheses that were removed from the dissertation for publication, only 38% of those were significant. So many of the non-significant hypotheses were removed. And what's even more concerning is that of the hypotheses that remained between the dissertations and the published articles, many of the unsupported hypotheses were changed to significant. So the direction was, so essentially the test was changed. And many of the supported hypotheses, very little of them were changed to non-significant. So essentially, what's going on here is that, one, the ratio of supported and unsupported hypotheses more than doubled between dissertations and published articles, but that this prevalence cannot really be attributable to one individual, just a couple bad apples, right, that are causing this. That essentially this is a systemic change in the culture of how research essentially is transformed to create this positive, publishable result that advances careers. And it's not just occurring in business management as well. If we look at clinical trials, comparetrials.org, they were tracking essentially the registrations of clinical trials to the outcomes that were eventually reported on those trials. So the 67 clinical trials that they had checked, only 9 of those perfectly matched, in the sense that all of the outcomes that they said that they were going to observe and record, that they actually reported on. And for whatever reasons, because they were not specified, an equal number of outcomes that were not reported on but were supposed to be collected occurred, as well as new outcomes that were silently added. And so this essentially makes it very troubling to understand what the decision-making process is and what the design of a given study changes into what's being reported. How is that being distorted? And if it's not being clear how that process is occurring, there's many ways to kind of hijack and essentially undermine the credibility of the research. And that's essentially how you get to a lot of recent articles of past that have really come to question whether most of the published research findings that we have are reliable as we think they can be. So essentially, are they generalizable, reproducible, replicable in the broad sense? And there's been a lot of evidence, anecdotal evidence from the pharmaceutical companies, for instance, as well as systematic efforts that we and others have attempted to actually try to measure what is the extent of being able to replicate and understand, and even having access to the information to understand the published literature. And so one thing I want to highlight a bit more, just for those who are a bit unfamiliar with this, is trying to really illustrate one of the ways that essentially the business management article hinted on, which is how there are different ways that we are operating when we conduct our research, and how confusing the two can actually complicate our interpretation of the data. And so one way to think about this is that our research is essentially undergoing two different ways. One is exploratory on the left, where the data are independent, explorable on the right, confirmation on the left. Exploring on the right is where we're basically exploring, creating hypotheses that are all data contingent. If we use any p-values, if we use any statistical tests, they're not so interpretable because of the fact that we're purely looking for patterns within the data that we're collecting. Versus on the left there, where we're doing confirmatory research, where we're actually testing a hypothesis of which the data needs to be independent from what we use to discover and generate those hypotheses, which is, again, the problem with harking. But the reason we get these two things intertwined is because if we present exploratory as confirmatory, right? If I say, oh, I found this interesting pattern, and by the way, here's the hypothesis that supports that pattern, right, after the fact, it increases the publishability of the results, right? It's very good to say, oh, I hypothesized this effect and I found this effect, even if that's not how the research actually transpired. And the risk is that we risk the cost of the credibility of those results. But there's already a mechanism in place that allows us to help with this, and it's essentially what occurs pretty well forcefully in clinical trials, which is pre-registration or registration. So when at the time of generating your study design, before you begin to collect data or before you begin analyzing data, if those data already exist, is to pre-register your analysis plan or pre-register your data collection plan. So that way, the path from what you intended to do to what you actually find has more credibility, and importantly, if we're using p-values, for instance, to help interpret our data, they have context and they are something that we can interpret. So we could go on and on. I'm sure you've had a lot of discussions in this. I'm sure you've had other speakers. I know you have by looking at what's on the MiRoR webinar site about all the challenges that exist. And there's a lot of different aspects, from selective reporting, flexibility, like I was just talking about, and analysis, power issues in terms of sample size. But something I want to draw attention to is that these are not new issues. These are not new discussions that we've had. These have been discussed before, and there are some citations on the bottom that kind of illustrate that we've had these types of moments of methodologists looking at what are some of the issues with the ways that we design our studies and the ways that we report and conduct our studies. And similarly, there have been solutions that have been increased. Basically using with pre-registration, but everything from how we go about reporting our results to how we should be doing power calculations or thinking about increase of sample size, or even shifting away from null hypothesis testing into precision estimates. And so that's actually what I want to talk about more in depth today, is the fact that we've had challenges and we've had solutions, and the issue has been implementation. That the culture has been something that's been very challenging to figure out how we improve the scientific ecosystem. And so the question then is why? Why is the current strategy that we've had ineffective? And again, the current strategy being around, let's study the issue, let's train and educate, and let's get people to essentially believe what they should know to do. And the reason is because, or the reason we think anyways, is that even though if you can have the knowledge of knowing what to change and have training and knowing how to change it, including believing it should be changed, which are those values, those are necessary aspects and they're not sufficient. In fact, you could even argue that while, say, training is a necessary aspect, values may not even be necessary. That you can create change through policy, through force, top down, even if that is not something that somebody wants to change, they want to do. And that's a bit of what I want to chat about, because essentially that means thinking about how culture change solutions have to be attentive to drivers of human behavior. So there's some additions that I'll talk about that we think are important. So one is the incentive systems, the reward systems, right? How do we incentivize to embrace the change, right? So not just saying, oh, this is what you should do, this is how I'll train you to do it, but to actually incentivize you to do it. And the other one is essentially leveraging infrastructure, right? We live in a more digital age, so how do we enable change? How do we make these barriers to behavior change easier and more possible? So we can think about this discussion in the sense of a pyramid approach, right? Where we have the top of the pyramid on very hard things to move in terms of shifting policies and shifting incentives. And at the bottom of it are things that are a bit more broad stroked approach of making it easier and possible, which is creating infrastructure and making that interface or that experience of doing it a lot easier. And I want to go through some highlights of these different aspects and then kind of touch back on this slide and this concept at the end. One thing that's important to think about when we're kind of think about the current culture as well as how do we kind of change that culture is that the ecosystem is pretty dynamic and large. So there's a lot of different stakeholders, right? Universities, the publishers, funders, societies, the researcher. And also it's very diverse, right? We have many disciplines and subdisciplines, all of which have slightly different values, slightly different operating procedures. So any solution essentially needs to be both flexible and and amenable to these changes to allow it to occur across the different stakeholders as well as across the different silos essentially of research. Okay, so we go back to that pyramid structure of how can we change the research culture. I'm going to focus a little bit on the top part, some policies, incentives. I'm going to focus largely on the work that we're doing, just to try to give some context around how we're thinking at the Center for Open Science about how we can change the research culture and some of the work we're doing around that. So if we think about policy, one of the big things that we've been working on is how to shift journal and funder policies to increase transparency and openness. And one of the things that we've done is these top guidelines, transparency and openness promotion guidelines. And the idea there is to make it a flexible structure that can map onto different types of systems as well as different disciplines, but all touch on the same key areas that were brought up during the meeting that generated these guidelines that go all the way from data citation and transparency through materials and essentially analysis process, including pre-registration, which I just mentioned, and including replication, something that we know is important but not performed enough in research, or at least not reported on enough in research. And the idea is not just to have these different standards, but to also have different barriers to entry, so different levels across it. So everything from not implementing it to a level 0, you can think of it, to whether you disclose any one of these, require any one of these aspects, or in some cases, in some journals, where they actually verify, where they actually will take the code and the data and see if they can computationally reproduce what was being submitted to them in the manuscript. And so this is meant to be at a high level of how journal policies can shift, how journals can shift their policies to embrace these changes, how they can move from not having a policy, say, on data transparency to slowly moving from disclosure to requirements to verification. And this complements a lot of other efforts that have been ongoing as well, which is one of which I'll highlight, which is essentially author checklists and reporting quality. So I'll highlight a preprint actually that was published in 2017 by the NPQIP collaborative group that were looking at the impact of author checklists on reporting quality. And so here they're looking at the implementation of Nature's author checklist, which they implemented in 2013. And they focused on just some key aspects, the Landis aspects, essentially around randomization, blinding, sample size estimation. And they wanted to know if there was any change that occurred from those Nature publications prior to implementation of a checklist, as well as looking at comparative publications in other journals that did not have an author checklist. And so if we look at the publications both before implementation of the checklist at Nature in 2013 and after, again, looking at these Landis 4 aspects, and again, just focusing on in vivo research just to kind of simplify it a bit. They saw a substantial increase in the reporting quality on these 4 compliance aspects around bias mitigation. In the Nature publications versus not the Nature publications, right, where you still saw a very low level of compliance. Now, there's obviously still a lot of room. So again, it's suggesting, one, that maybe the checklists are a way to nudge the change in behavior, but it's maybe not sufficient to actually change it because of compliance issues, right? So even if you require somebody to do this, is anybody actually checking it, for instance? Because again, this study was done to actually check to make sure these 4 aspects which are required were actually being reported. But it does show you that this simple aspect of introducing and requiring an author checklist at time of submission is a simple means to increase the reporting quality. I'm also going to think about another way to kind of shift both the policy, but also try to get a little bit into the incentive aspects. So right now, if we think about the traditional academic publishing model, again, very simplified, of developing the idea, designing the study, to all the way to writing it, eventually being lucky enough to submit it. Hopefully it goes to peer review, and then it gets published. And at this stage, in the traditional manner, all the peer review, all the focus is on, well, how beautiful are those results, right? How clean is the story? Any bias that even the reviewers have at that stage are on the results, not so much how you went about collecting your data or analyzing your data, but more about what those outcomes are and how they fit with their own beliefs. And so naturally, as many have reported on, this means that publication of, say, a null result is very, very challenging in this, because it's not the positive result that everyone wants. And it also encourages, in some cases, some questionable behavior, right, around, data trimming or exclusion of certain criteria. Essentially, this is a good illustration of, going back to that business management report, of the pressures of peer review and the pressures of publishing, and how that can shape the research that's being presented. So the idea here is that we can maybe shift that, right? We can change the incentive of the researcher by moving the peer review earlier in the process. And so this is a format that's called registered reports that we advocate for, and that Chris Chambers has done a lot of effort on developing and leading. And there's over, if you go to the site at the bottom, there's over 100 journals now that offer this across all disciplines. And the idea here is to be able to shift that process earlier in the steps, where before data collection occurs, before analysis occurs, that's when the first stage of peer review occurs. And so there, instead of it being about, well, what are the results, and do those results conform with my beliefs, are they basically, is it a very beautiful result, and all those questionable behaviors? Instead, it's about, well, how are you going to design that study? So essentially embracing that concept of pre-registration, but including it and incentivizing it within the current publication model. And the important part is, if you pass that first stage of peer review, right, if you have a good design, and if it's a question that we want to know the answer to regardless, so it's not just a good design, but it's also a good research question, the journal agrees to publish it regardless of what those results are, as long as it passes minimal quality steps that are specified beforehand. So that second stage to peer review is not about, well, does this, give me a clean story, does this give me positive results, but more, is this accurately reported, and is it transparent about what you actually designed to do versus what you're reporting. So this is a way that we can shift the incentives within the current incentive system, right, which is around publications, but we can actually shift the incentives within it to embrace and increase credibility of published results. Now again, a lot of this, and I would hope that there are questions on this, this is largely theory-based, right, that this concept of moving peer review earlier is a theory-based approach. And so one of the things that we're very interested in, and is a great opportunity to also further investigate, is how true is this, right? Is the concepts of registered report, in terms of increasing the public publishability of null results, as well as increasing the rigor and design of those studies, is that actually happening? And I think that's an open-ended question, of which there should be continued research on this, because this is a new publishing model that should be continually investigated to see if it's actually meeting those standards and those assumptions. And so I'm going to talk about one more, which is an incentive, but it's actually focused a bit more around the cultural aspects of it, how you can embrace, how the culture can essentially encourage it from the researcher groups and those communities. And so here it's on badges, basically making those behaviors, those open behaviors around sharing of data, sharing of materials, or pre-registering your study. If you can essentially incentivize people to do those practices just by giving them a badge to promote that behavior and to see that within the community. So essentially the community drives the norms, and they see that if somebody else is sharing their data, one, that's something that I see as valuable and that encourages me to do it. So it's community driven. And the key here is that it's community driven because it's not something the journal gives and is required to do. It does not require you to share your data, for instance, if it's not a policy. And it's not an incentive. It's not saying if you share your data, I'll let you publish the paper. Instead, it's saying when you publish your paper, based on the current policies and the current incentives, I will add this additional icon that essentially should drive adoption of these behaviors within that community. So we did an early investigation to ask if that actually was occurring. If simply allowing an author to get a badge after having their paper accepted but before it's published, so essentially just acknowledging that open behavior, actually changed the behavior within the community. And so in 2014, beginning of 2014, the journal Psychological Science, which is PSCI, so the dark black line graph here, implemented badges. So basically allowed it so that a researcher could, if they wanted to, be acknowledged with having this icon included on their manuscript that they did this behavior. Again, not a requirement, not a policy, and not a shift per se in incentives to get them to do it. And so when we look at just at the percent of articles that reported whether data were available, and we looked at Psychological Science as well as 4 other comparative journals that published similar content. When we look at the 2 years prior to when badges were implemented, we saw very low data sharing rates. And again, this is not surprising. Others have reported on the lack of data transparency within the published literature. But what we saw was that when badges were introduced, which is that dotted red line there, that within just Psychological Science, there was a substantial increase in the number of articles that made their data, or at least had a statement saying their data was available. And again, just by shifting and having it so that the articles would have this badge indicating when they did it. So I think there's lots of more research to be done on this, and some of that work has already begun. But it shows that there is a mechanism that you can change behavior, or at least select for that behavior within journals to encourage it by acknowledging it, right? By allowing those communities to essentially make it a normative value. All right, and I'm going to talk briefly now about these bottom 2. And again, if there's any questions, please feel free to stop me or chat. So a lot of what I just discussed was essentially at the policy level or at the journal level, right? So essentially trying to say, well, what can we do within the current system to shift it and change the research culture towards, increasing the credibility, openness, and transparency of results. But there's another aspect to do this, which is just making it possible, making it easier for the researcher themselves to do this, or making it at least easier for them to do it if they've always wanted to or were doing it from other mechanisms. So for instance, data sharing, right? If there was no mechanism before and people were putting it on their personal websites, is there a way that technology can be used to increase the ability for a researcher on their own accord to share their data, right? Regardless of whether it has a badge, regardless of whether the journal requires it, or there's some other incentive system in place. So again, I'm going to leverage on an example of what we're doing. There's many examples of groups that are working to essentially do this bottom-up approach, especially with all of the technological solutions that can occur across disciplines. And one I'll talk about is the work that we're doing on the Open Science Framework. And so it's a free platform that allows researchers to basically collaborate, share, upload their content, and pre-register. But one of the things that is maybe not quite fully understood by everyone, but I think illustrates a lot of what I was just talking about in terms of how changing a culture is our technological solutions essentially mapping onto that. So on the bottom here, we have the Open Science Framework, right? It's a visual way for somebody to engage with, an app to do some behavior, like share data, for instance. And it's built upon different types of services and a different technological ecosystem that occurs, basically connecting together other tools that already exist. But there's different ways that we can have people look into that interface. So for instance, and I'll give you an example after I'm done talking about this, you could imagine that at the institutional level, that they have a different interface than at just the individual level, or if they want to share something like preprints, that has a different view than if they're using a registry to collate their registered studies. And all of these interfaces allow then communities to sit on top of those and essentially create that branding, that normative value, right? So if I'm, NYU and I have an OSF institution account, that creates that community effort of saying, okay, great, here at NYU, this is a way for us to advocate and demonstrate and basically encourage sharing of data at our community level. So let me give you an example of what I mean here within preprints. So preprints, right, are the manuscript that's essentially being submitted to the journal. At least that's the cleanest definition of it. So we have a view, an interface. So if you go to osf.io/preprints, you essentially get landed to this generic preprint site. And if you go in here, you can see an example of how, oh, it's so easy to share your manuscript. So one, we created a technology that made it easy for somebody to do this and possible for somebody to upload a preprint. But what this also allows us to do is allow branding of that preprint at the community. So now, for instance, here's one of the preprint communities that we support, Earth Archive preprints. Now this community for the Earth Sciences has that same interface, but it's dedicated towards them. So now that community can advocate for this behavior, encourage this behavior, promote this behavior, even though it's using a shared common background, a common technological solution. And what we do is we aggregate this. So there's over 20 preprint communities that we currently support. We aggregate it with other communities, other servers like Archive and bioRxiv that already exist, that are already doing this. And this allows one, aggregation of everything that's occurring behind it, but it facilitates the ability for that culture to change at that community level. So again, none of this is a policy per se, but it can get complemented with policy. And so one way to think about kind of our approach and getting back to that pyramid, but before I do that is to really think about what has been discussed by Rogers in terms of innovations, and again, looking at technological innovations, but mapping this into how you change a research culture. So if we think of the distribution of the individuals who are going to engage in some behavior that we're attempting to change, with that pre-registration or opening, sharing more data or whatever aspect, increasing the reporting of bias mechanisms or education of including those blinding randomization in your study design. Essentially, there's going to be this traditional curve that's occurring, right, where we have early adopters that are innovating it. They're going to do it purely because they believe in it. But the trick then is, how do you get those innovators to move to early adopters, to early majority, to eventually getting in the late majority and the laggards? How do you get to fully change the culture? Because it doesn't occur all at once. It's going to occur slowly over time. And so we turn this actually gets back to essentially our pyramid approach, right? Those early innovators, if you just make it possible for somebody to pre-register their study, for example, they'll do it, right? Because they believe in it and they acknowledge it and they support it. But the problem and the real challenge we have is not those early innovators. It's how you move what is being done at those early innovative steps into the majority of researchers, the majority of the people you want to have that behavior change occur. And so in order to do that, we have to make it easier, right? Because those early innovators they'll do it even if it's a really painfully slow process because they believe in it. But to make it easier and to reach more researchers, you have to increase the accessibility of that tool or that process or that behavior. To make it normative, we probably have to start getting those communities to do it, right? So those like-minded groups, those disciplines and subdisciplines, they have to all believe in this until you start to see that slowly move and capture more of the researchers. And similarly, you might need to change and make it rewarding, right? And change the incentive system, make it so that there's a reason that somebody wants to do this behavior. And policy only really has to occur for those laggers, people who just don't want to do it. They're resistant to change. And you're just trying to figure out how to get the rest across the line. And that's where that kind of more difficult step with policy can come into play to actually allow a better capture of shifting the research culture towards a certain behavioral aspect. So here's just an example of one, kind of a way to think about it. This is where I'll end and open it up for questions, which is how do we even think about the different groups and how they move along this in terms of, again, focusing a lot on what the Center for Open Science is doing. There's many other groups that are doing great things that map onto this. So we very much try to focus these aspects onto different stakeholders at the same time. So if I'm a researcher, we're encouraging them to use something like OSF or other digital tools that are easy, that make it easy and possible to do some behavior change. We create challenges, we create basically templates to increase the ability for them to do new behavior like pre-registration. We encourage researchers to try submitting to registry reports or submitting a preprint, right? So that they themselves taking the action to try a new behavior, and we creating infrastructure and working with ways to create community engagement or even incentives to change that behavior. Similarly, from journals and funders, you need to have them allow these behaviors to be encouraged. So the badges are directed towards those journals and funders, registry reports are, and those top guidelines at the policy level. And then similarly, the institutions and societies at the same time, that's where those, for example, connecting services across different tools, as well as doing something like OSF for institutions or creating, a branded preprint server. Those are ways to create those community norms. And so I think, as we continue to view how we can, tackle culture change and investigate culture change, we have to continually think about the entire ecosystem while we're doing that. All right, so it went a little bit longer than a little bit faster than I thought, but I'm gonna stop there and open up for some questions. I know that they're recording this, but I also wanted to have a link accessible in case anybody wanted to download these slides. And after this, the last slide has references in case there's any specific articles that I had discussed that somebody wanted to look at further. And in this case, I'll just say thank you for giving me the opportunity and open it up for any questions.
Well, thank you so much for this great presentation and all these issues you highlighted with all the possible solution. Perhaps I will start waiting for the others, people who want to ask some questions. I was quite interested by the proposal you made to change the systems in terms of peer review and to propose a peer review much earlier in the system. But do you think, because one of the issues with the peer review is, I agree that it's late, but another issue is that the quality of the peer review is not so good because the peer reviewer don't always provide relevant feedback, don't always provide, don't always improve the quality of the report or improve the quality of the methods. And further, a lot of studies already have a peer review process to obtain a grant, for example, in academic studies. For example, when we plan randomized controlled trials, we first have a quite strong peer review for obtaining the grant. Mm-hmm. So how do you think it will really change?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's a couple of things in terms of how that can change. So I was going to try to go back to it. One way to think about it is that in the current peer review process, it's essentially, especially at the journal level, it's very after the fact, right? You're doing it because you feel you have to do it. It's more about a gatekeeping mechanism than a true improvement on the process. And I think that is one way to think about the poor quality of peer review is the fact of where it sits currently. And so ways to think about shifting it is that this registered reports peer review is essentially a bit closer to grant peer review, but in more detail. And because those results are not known, what you're really looking for is feedback on design. So any feedback you're going to get should be an improvement on it. And you can also map that very nicely, because it's the right stage, to certain requirements. So you think about all the reporting guidelines that are going on. There's great ones out there, ARRIVE guidelines for animal research, consort, and so on and so on. Those are still focused on reporting of the behavior, but what we really want to do is create the behavior. And so if you can have those types of guidelines and checklists complemented at earlier peer review that's completely focused on the design quality, that I think creates a better mechanism to encourage, essentially valuable peer review. Again, it's very theoretical at this point, so we need to be investigating this to see if this actually can stand up for it. One interesting pilot example that's occurring, and there's about 3 different groups that have been trying this, is also tying the peer review of the registered report, so the publication, to the grant, right? So saying, okay, and this works well for small foundations, so a good example would be the Children's Tumor Foundation is doing this for 2 projects, and they're in collaboration with I believe, PLOS1 to be the publisher. And when they had very specific grant requests that they were looking for, when they had the reviews come in for whether they should basically award the grant, they also had a simultaneous process where the reviews were also investigating whether that was going to be accepted as a registered report at PLOS1. So basically the results being published no matter what they find. And so that essentially now gets two mechanisms at the same point, right? Which is this a quality study that we should fund, right? So is it a good rigor, good design? And then can we make sure that those results are being published no matter what? Because that's just as important, especially from the funder standpoint of making sure those results are known, as long as, again, it passes minimal quality steps. And I think that's an exciting opportunity to, again, think about what is the point of any given peer review and how can you better leverage those strengths versus, again, you saying, oh, your job is to tell me if this is exciting to be published and will create readership or is an exciting result, right? Which is, again, all that point, the focus is on what you found, not how you designed it. So those are some of the thoughts that I have on that. There's some, like I said, some early investigations into this, but I think what is different from some of the earlier studies on peer review is that this, because it's shifting, it's essentially a different type of peer review that needs to get investigated independently of those prior studies.
Oh, thanks. Did you find any, because one of the essential barrier of such a model I would see would be researchers, probably more in the field of basic science, not willing to share their protocol because it's such competitive, and you can, if you're in a small university with a low level of funding, that a big team and much faster would obtain your results. So that could be a very important barrier. Did you find something like that, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. So at first I thought you were thinking of talking about protocol in the sense of IP. Nobody wants to disclose it at all, regardless of anything. But I think what, and correct me if you're wrong, you're referring more about scooping, the fear that if I disclose what I plan to do before I do it, somebody's going to beat me to it because of resources, which you're absolutely right that there's definitely a disparity of that at different institutes. So the easy mechanism to get around that, because again, that's a valid concern. Whether it's actually problematic is another question, because we do that in grant review, and there are instances of people taking ideas, but I don't know how systemic that is embargoing the protocol, essentially. So you embargo the design. So again, there's still an inherent trust that the reviewers will not take it and go on their own. That's always going to exist. That exists currently. You just embargo that first stage of peer review. You don't have to publish that, and you only publish that stage when the results are in. So that's one that protects the researcher who says, here's my design I've got in principal acceptance. The only people who know are the journal and the reviewers. They're not, they're under an agreement that they're not going to share. Nobody else can see what I'm doing until I do it. So I essentially have a embargoed head start, similar to a grant. The risk, though, there's another risk that comes onto that then, which is, well, what happens if that researcher finds an exciting result, right? So it's nice to say, so again, take Children's Tumor Foundation. It's nice to say you've got an in-principle acceptance at PLOS1, but what if you find some incredibly exciting result and you as the researcher want to go to science with it? And then you as the researcher believe that science is better for your career than PLOS1, which I think, sadly, many scientists probably agree with. What do you do then, right? What do you do about the fact that you have in principle acceptance at one journal, but the publication is occurring at another journal? And the key there is that you still open up that first stage of method, right? You still disclose and say, this is what they designed, and this is what they intended to do at our journal. Whether they decided to publish here or not was their opinion. And you can link that back to the final published article, even if it is in a different journal. So, because that's the other risk that you'd have, is that instead of somebody scooping your idea, is that you essentially lose the transparency that you gained in this process. Again, we've not had anybody do that because it's kind of essentially early days for this registered reports idea. But I think these are really important considerations to think about. And again, we actually have currently here at the center, we're actually trying to investigate whether registered reports even increase the rigor. So getting back to your first question, because we don't even know if that's true per se, because again, it's very theory-based. And so we're doing some early, kind of basically just observational studies on what's been published to get an idea of, is there any difference in the type of reporting that's occurring in registered reports versus non-registered reports? But these are really good questions that I think should continue to be asked and investigated while, especially in these early phases of the initiative being launched, because it's a great time to, one, stop it if it's not meeting those behaviors or if the risks are too high, or probably more importantly is to feed into how you can better shape that initiative to actually have the impact that one wants, versus just implementing some policy, running away and hoping it works.
Yeah, thanks. So perhaps another point I'd like to have your view on it, because you highlighted at the beginning of your presentation, is the p-value. And my feeling is that the fact that everything relies on the p-value, how you're going to conclude your study relies on the p-value. And for me, it's responsible a lot for the different misconduct or detrimental research practices that we could see. So are you working on other ways to present results, or other ways to interpret results, or other metric than the p-value we could use? Or other approach we could have to avoid this p-value focus?
Yeah, no, yeah, I mean, so there's, and I think you've probably come across it, there's been a handful of really interesting papers that have been published. The one I'm thinking of that's most recent that our executive director, Brian Nozick, among other folks across it, including John Anides, is basically, getting at your point of, well, let's decrease the p-value threshold from 0.05 to 0.00. Right?
Yeah.
So we've been engaged loosely on those efforts. We've never really, there are other organizations that are doing great things on this front. I think it's incredibly important to advocate for this. We've been very much on the approach of let's try to get more information on disclosure. So again, trying to say, show me what you did and share what you did, opposed to changing that behavior. A lot of our efforts have been on that first front, because we feel that right now is a huge challenge in itself. So even if you want somebody to change the way that they're reporting it, completely agree. I mean, even just shifting away from p-values, going more towards effect sizes, there's great work and a lot of reason to do that. But I think the first step has got to be, can you at least disclose your data so I can see that? And can you disclose your decisions so I can assess it? Because again, whether you choose 0.05 or 0.001 as your threshold if you're doing the null hypothesis testing, I still need to understand if you did that a priori or not, because there's very different reasons for it. And the same thing even with effect sizes, right? Like, how do I know what you're including or excluding in your analysis? So I think we're trying to go back a little bit farther to help facilitate that discussion that has been ongoing for a while, to actually give it the possibility to change that, right? Because then you can start to have more open discussions of, oh, well, now I see how you're analyzing your data. Let's see if we can shift the way we're reporting that. Again, a good example, a simple one, again, always trying to think of like broad things that cut across all disciplines, even less quantitative ones, is basically a group that wants to get rid of bar graphs, right? Bar graphs, which is a great example, because there's lots of evidence that has suggested that just reporting of bar graphs is incredibly misleading to the researcher because you don't understand the underlying distribution, let alone the fact that they're doing bar graphs and reporting means and standard deviations for incredibly, non-normal data. So it's very, very misleading. And so you have no idea, right? You have no idea what that looks like, because so instead of just saying, hey, let's change and get rid of bar graphs, what you first have to do is say, can I at least see your data to fully understand and appreciate why we need to get rid of that? Because I think that's the hard part, getting back again to the pyramid of, there's many people that you can tell them why it's important, you can tell them what to do, but it probably still won't change that because there's no incentive to shift it. And there's no easy way for them to understand. So I think we're trying to, a lot of our efforts, at least at the Center for Open Science, has been focused a bit earlier in that process. But it doesn't change I think what you're getting at is that those all need to change. We need to figure out ways to shift presentation. I'm again a big fan of the more disclosure you get, it actually helps facilitate reuse, which right now is pretty small in research. So people can't even have the luxury of reanalyzing data as much as they would like. And a good example is the amount of the difficulty it is within doing meta-analysis studies with varying reporting standards across articles. There's a question online here. I'm going to answer first if that's okay.
Sure.
David asked, I think it's going back to registered reports and back to my comment on reporting guidelines. And David said the point is that there already exist reporting guidelines for different types of study protocols which can be used by peer reviewers. Is the idea then to make it more common to get protocols published and therefore peer reviewed? And I think that is absolutely a part of it. Whether that gets, I mean, the idea is to get more protocols published because again, you can embargo it. I know at least in my discipline, my background, the protocols that are being used rarely get published. We usually say, oh, it's just standard techniques, or see this other paper for the protocol, and there's nothing there. And so this actually forces somebody to get those protocols up front and to allow them to be peer reviewed all before data collection occurs. Again, recognizing that you can embargo it because there can be concerns around disclosing your study design and your study question in advance. But then I think David's point is actually right. Because there are these reporting guidelines, those work well for helping report, but the real underlying concern is not so much reporting, but it's the behavior of doing it. And so if you can shift the review and shift the point where those reporting guidelines have the highest impact, which is at design, if you can basically have it so that the researcher is incentivized to pay attention to those, the reviewers are incentivized to enforce those and encourage those, I think that shifts it. Because I know that whenever you're asking for these things after the fact, it just seems like everybody's trying to jump through a hoop versus actually change their behavior. Again, whether this can actually occur, I think still needs to be studied, but I mean, I think this is a great mechanism to allow that to occur, where it doesn't really have much legs. And there's another question from Alice. So I'll read this and answer. I was very interested in the preprints. I was wondering if there are journals at odds with this. That's a great question, as they usually ask that your manuscript hasn't been published elsewhere. On the other hand, are there any journals out there that are complementary and encouraging of preprints? And no, nobody's asked this question. It's a great question, Alice. I'm blanking right now at the moment on what website this is, but there is a site. I will email it to the organizers. They can share this. And it basically collates all the journal policies and what those policies are on preprints. And again, blanking on the name, but basically it's an easy way to say, okay, I'm interested in publishing and submitting my manuscript to this journal. I can look at this site who's collated all the journal policies around preprints to ask, what is that journal's policy? And so what's encouraging is that, yes, there are a couple of holdout journals still that don't allow the submitted article to be published as a preprint, but that's actually, I think, shifted dramatically. The vast majority of journals now allow it in one way or another, and so, but then there is some fine tune in terms of what that means, right? So some are saying it's fine if you do it on a trusted repository like what we have with OSF or bioRxiv or archive. Others say that's the only way you can do that because I don't allow it if you were to post a preprint on your personal website. That's not allowed. And so you do have to read some of the policies around it as well as what you can post as a preprint. So a good example of this is what should you post, since we know there's multiple stages. So right, by my first submission versus my revision versus my accepted article versus my published article, right? And all of those are different stages, and every journal has slightly different policies on what is allowed and what's not allowed and in what format. In general, most journals, a vast majority of journals, are fine with you submitting your submitted or accepted copy as long as it has not undergone any editorial changes. Although there are a few journals that are completely fine with posting your accepted articles after they've been, basically your manuscript after it's been accepted, which is essentially the equivalent of a post-print. And so those two names, post-print and preprint, if you get through these discussions, they're kind of masquerading themselves. Those are two ends of the spectrum about acceptance. And that's usually where a lot of the policies change. So I'll look up that site, just blanking on the name of it at the moment, and send it out. because if anybody's interested in doing it, I highly recommend they first check it, so that way they don't accidentally get themselves in trouble with their journal, just because the current approach right now is you still hand over your copyright to the journal for the most part. And preprints are not at odds, but you do need to be attentive to it. The other encouraging sign, just as a side note to that, is how funders are starting to shift their awareness and recognition of preprints. And so a good example in the States here is NIH's change in policy around preprints, how preprints are now allowed to be included in any grant submission as an interim document. And I think that is brilliant, because especially for early career researchers who might not have their research published because of the lag that occurs during peer review, this allows them to not just say manuscript submitted or manuscript under review, but actually to show this is my manuscript. If you want to see it, here's the preprint of it before it's published. A good example of this, because I think it's a really good story, is a colleague of mine who started at UCSF. When he first started there, he naturally, took a while to get his publications going, especially as he would venture off into slightly separate subgroups, subdisciplines. So he had one research project that kind of went off a little bit on a different new area that he just entered. So a brand new, community of researchers that he could engage. Submitted his paper, but he posted it also as a preprint on bioRxiv. And so it took a year plus before it finally came out in print, but he had that preprint. And so when he was able to give conference presentations, he was also able to point them back to his preprint, say, here's actually the article, it just hasn't been published yet. And in that year plus time, it was about a year and a half time, he was able to secure a grant, he was able to get invitations to more conferences to talk about his work and set up collaborations, all because he could post it as a preprint and have something easy to share and have others discover it on their own without having to wait for the publication. So I think it's a good example of where the two can work together and actually help facilitate and move someone's career.
Great, thank you very much. Perhaps as a last question that would be sort of out of the topic, but more on perhaps your background and how you came to work toward this field and how you came to work for the Center for Open Science, because our students, they're finishing their PhD in about 1 year, a bit more than 1 year, but about 1 year, and so they're starting thinking about what type of job and work they could work on, and so it would be nice for them to learn about all this Center for Open Science you work for and you developed.
Yeah, absolutely, happy to. So I'll give you, so my background is when I was finishing my PhD in cancer biology, preclinical cancer biology. In my mindset at that point, I was very interested in going into biotech, and the reasons behind that was just I was more interested in the application of the research I was doing. And interesting, at that same time, that's when for anybody who's in that preclinical biomed space, I graduated right when Bayer and Amgen were giving their white papers that got published in Nature on their inability to, basically replicate results. And that, it definitely was, it naturally created a lot of discussion around, well, what's going on? A little bit of, it felt like pointing the finger to some people, but I was more interested in saying, wow, that's interesting, because I've had my own difficulties in my own research career, basically being able to replicate results, including in my own lab, right? The research project I had picked up in my graduate career was from another student, and even though I had access to everything in the lab, the materials, the notebooks, everything, we still couldn't figure out how I could get the same result. And it was lack of information. And I was thinking, wow, here I am in the lab, access to all these protocols, all this details that never made it into the final paper. And I'm having a hard time understanding it. No one else will be able to do it. So here I am finishing my graduate career, hearing this report of something that very much resonated with my career, not at all looking for it, and finding out about the Center for Open Science just starting as an organization. So it was 5 years ago. And realizing actually it just happened to be in the own town I was in Charlottesville, Virginia. And so I basically took the opportunity to go down and have a discussion with Brian Nozick, the executive director, back when there was really nobody here. They had just started, and just introduced myself, learned about the center, was just really excited about it. And offered to just be a part of it any way I could. It's basically recognizing that I was going to go start applying. I had started applying for all these other jobs, but I just wanted to be a part of it because I really believed in what the organization was set up to do, and I still believe that today. And just opening the door there, kind of introducing myself, being excited about it, having a long discussion with him that he was open to. He basically called the next day and asked if I wanted to be a part of the team here and to lead the meta science team and to basically do the project that I'm now leading on in cancer biology research. And so I think it was a fortuitous example of kind of reaching out to an individual or to an organization that excites you, and just basically having the time to create the chance to develop an opportunity that even if it doesn't exist. So I think that everywhere always says that, oh, it's just, how did I get to where I happen to be? And it's like, oh, it's just chance. And I think in some ways that's true, but in many ways you just create your own chance by engaging and looking for what excites you. And then so real quick, I'll make one little some awareness to be what's going on here at the Center for Open Science. So for those not familiar, there's three main areas that we work on. I lead our research team, our meta science team. We have a lot of community team. So all that policy work that I was talking about, engaging stakeholders. We have a whole team that's devoted to that. And then the technology, I showed you, we have a lot of developers that are developing the technology to help complement and facilitate some of these behavior changes that we're trying to aim towards. So one is always be attentive to, if you like what we're doing and you want to hear more, feel free to shoot me an email. Always happy to respond by email or set up a call if that's fine. And also just look at our own site. Within our own meta science team, we have a couple of proposals, and if that happens, I'll actually be looking to expand our team to bring on some more researchers in the near term. So if a couple grants come through, our organization ourselves will be looking for some recent graduates to help us to move our research forward. So I think, just as the last point there, just, if you want to hear more about what we're doing, just check out our site, reach out to me, and just be attentive to anything that changes. I'll let you know if I see anything.
Great, thank you very much. I think it's the story of, you're just enthusiastic and go and see people and find your a good job where you're having a lot of fun. It's great, and I think it's the best way to do it. Yes. So unless anyone has something to add, well, I would like to thank you so much for this. It's been very, very interesting and very useful, and I think the MiRoR project and all what you're doing share really a strong common view and common interest. So I think it would be nice to continue having link with the MiRoR consortiums, and probably you for any other way we'd have to think about it. But it's been a great opportunity for us and a great opportunity for the student. So well, thank you so much. And I don't know if there's anything you want to add or.
No, it's just the last thing I'd say is my email's up there. Feel free if you have any additional questions, just shoot me an email. Happy to answer them. And thank you for the opportunity. I think it's great what you guys are doing. So I think this is, in my opinion, an emerging area that we're going to start seeing grow a lot and more. I already know a lot of universities are starting to think about how they engage and create more opportunities for essentially meta research, right? Because they know that this is vital. So I think it's an exciting time to be taking a step back and investigating it. That's just my biased opinion. So thank you for the opportunity to chat.
Thank you very much, and have a nice day. Thank you so much.
All right, bye.
Bye.